They say the glory of Rome was built upon stone, steel, and sacrifice, but in the shadows beneath that glory lay a truth darker than the marble temples and golden triumphs, a truth carved not in victory, but in suffering. For while senators feasted and generals paraded in triumph, there were men and women whose names will never be remembered, their backs bent, their bodies broken, their lives swallowed by the earth itself. These were the slaves of the salt mines, the forgotten lifeblood of an empire. Salt to Rome was more than taste, more than preservation. It was power. It preserved armies. It fueled trade. It defined wealth. Entire legions marched for it. Entire wars were fought over it. The word salary itself comes from salt. For soldiers were once paid in it, and in a city where power demanded preservation, salt was as vital as blood. Yet salt did not come easily. It came from the depths of suffocating mines, from caverns of darkness where sunlight never entered. It came from the chained hands of men who had once been free, but who now knew only silence and stone. Rome did not mine salt with free citizens. No citizen would lower himself into the pits of shadow, for the mines were death sentences to fuel the empire. Slaves were taken prisoners of war, rebels crushed in uprisings, debtors who could no longer pay. Their chains were fastened not only to wrists and ankles, but to their fates. For once a slave descended into the mines, he would not return. The salt would cling to his skin, burn his eyes, eat into his wounds. The air itself was poison, a dust that shredded lungs. Men coughed blood before their youth was gone. Imagine the path of such a slave, a man once a farmer tending his fields under the sun. Perhaps he had a wife and children. Perhaps he had known laughter. Then Rome came, Rome with its eagles, Rome with its legions. He was seized, dragged in chains, paraded through a market where his body was weighed like an animal. A buyer with cold eyes looked at him, not as a man, but as labor. Soon he was herded with others beaten when he faltered, driven further and further from his home until stones swallowed him whole. The mines became his world. His sky was the ceiling of rock. His sun was the torch that flickered in choking smoke. Day after day, slaves were lowered into caverns so deep they could no longer hear the wind. The salt clung to their flesh. It cracked their lips and blinded their eyes. Every cut, every scratch festered in agony. For salt that preserves life above the ground destroys life below it. It gnawed at the skin until sores spread and wounds never healed. The overseers cared nothing for suffering. They demanded only labor. To falter meant a lash across the back. To resist meant death. Yet death was not feared. In truth, it was a mercy, for the mines offered no escape, no release, no hope. The work was endless. They carried baskets heavy with crystal and rock, staggering through tunnels that grew narrower with every strike. The walls dripped with bitter water. The air was thick. Each breath felt like fire in the lungs. Men collapsed and were left where they fell. The chain gangs marched past them, stepping over the lifeless bodies of those who could no longer move. At night they were not freed. They slept still, shackled to one another, lying upon cold stone, listening to the coughs and wheezing of men dying slowly. The darkness was absolute. Only the sound of chains reminded them they were still alive. And yet despite this torment, the empire above never paused. Salt poured from the mines into wagons that creaked through the city gates. To the senators, salt was wealth. To the generals, salt was victory. To the citizens, salt was life. But to the slaves, it was death. The irony was cruel, for their sweat gave Rome its strength, and their blood gave Rome its glory. Yet their names were never spoken. They were shadows in history, forgotten beneath the grandeur of emperors and monuments. Women, too, were thrown into this abyss, captured in conquest or punished for debts. They, too, were shackled and lowered into the pits. They carried loads alongside men, their hands torn, their bodies broken. Some were taken only for the cruelty of it, for Rome believed slaves were not people, but property. In the darkness these women endured torment of every kind, and when they bore children, those infants were not free. They were born into chains, born into darkness, their first breath filled with the dust of salt mines, their lives condemned before they began. Thus generations were buried alive beneath the surface of Rome, never knowing light, never knowing freedom. What cruelty it must have been to live knowing you would never again feel the sun. Men would dream of the fields they once walked, of the rivers they once swam. They whispered memories to one another, to remind themselves they had once been human. One spoke of vineyards heavy with grapes, another of olive groves, another of the laughter of children. Those memories burned brighter than any torch, yet they cut deeper than any lash, for the more they remembered, the more they realized how completely those lives had been stolen. Above ground the empire sang. Rome celebrated victories in the Colosseum. Rome praised its generals and worshipped its gods. Yet none asked what price was paid beneath their feet. None heard the muffled cries in caverns deep. None saw the hands bleeding from endless toil. To the citizens salt simply appeared as if by divine gift. To the rulers it was tribute to their greatness, but to the slaves it was a tomb. Still there were whispers even in the pits. Even in that hell, men dared to believe in something beyond their chains. Some told stories of escape, though none who tried ever returned. Some prayed to gods to deliver them. Some simply held the hope that in death they would be free, that beyond the veil they would once again walk beneath the sun. For in such darkness even the faintest glimmer of hope became a flame that could not be extinguished. The years passed, yet the mines never emptied. For every slave who fell, another was brought down. For every body that withered, another was chained in its place. The empire demanded salt, and so the empire demanded lives. The overseers grew rich, the merchants thrived, the generals fed their armies, and Rome itself gleamed brighter with every grain. But beneath that gleam the shadows deepened. Whole villages were emptied, whole tribes erased so that the Roman people might dine in comfort and march to war. Their victories were written in stone, but the cost was written only in the silence of the mines. It was said that no slave survived more than a few years in those depths, some barely months. The salt ate them alive, skin-hardened lungs, shredded bones, bent under ceaseless weight. They aged decades in days. Hair whitened, eyes dulled, flesh grew hollow. A man of 20 looked as if he were 60. The body could not endure such punishment. The heart could not withstand such despair. Yet still they labored, for chains do not break themselves. There were times when rebellion stirred. Whispers spread through the tunnels that perhaps they could overpower the guards, seize the wagons, escape into the forests. But the mines were far from cities and always watched, and even if a slave fled, where could he run? With scars upon his flesh, with chains still heavy upon his wrists, he could not hide for long. Rome was everywhere. Its legions marched across the world. Its spies listened in every village. Its cruelty left no corner untouched. Thus rebellion was crushed before it began. A whisper silenced. A leader whipped until nothing remained. The rest returned to their toil. The dream of freedom buried once more. Children born in the mines knew no other life. They grew in darkness, their small hands forced to carry stones before they had strength to walk properly. Their laughter turned to coughs, their games to labor, and when they looked upward, they did not know what sky meant. When older slaves described sunlight to them, they thought it a story, a myth, something imagined, for they had never seen it. They believed the world was stone. They believed chains were natural. They believed their suffering was fate. Such was the deepest cruelty, not only to enslave the body, but to enslave the mind. And yet even in such despair, humanity flickered. Slaves shared what little strength they had with one another. A crust of bread passed hand to hand, a sip of water given to the weakest, a story whispered in the night, reminding them they were still alive. They mourned together when one fell. They remembered the names of the dead. They prayed silently that some greater justice might one day balance the scales. It was all they could give each other. And though Rome sought to strip them of dignity, these small acts kept them human. Above ground, life continued as though nothing stirred below. The salt flowed endlessly into the empire. Soldiers salted their meat, merchants sold their wares, citizens seasoned their bread, senators debated not about lives but about trade routes, about taxes, about profits. The wealth of Rome was written in marble forums, but its foundation lay in the sweat and blood of the nameless. For without the salt of the mines, Rome could not march, Rome could not feast, Rome could not endure. And so the empire built monuments upon bones. Centuries later, when the power of Rome began to fade, when barbarians pressed at its borders, when emperors fell to assassins and generals to ambition, the mines did not cease. Even as cities burned, the mines demanded life. Even as emperors fled, the slaves still toiled. For the machine of Rome outlasted even its rulers, and the mines were part of that machine. They consumed generation after generation until Rome itself crumbled and vanished into memory. But the mines remained silent, graves holding the echoes of countless voices lost to time. What remains now is not their bodies, for the salt consumed them. It is not their names, for history erased them. What remains is the weight of their suffering, hidden in the legacy of empire. The streets tourists walk upon, the ruins they admire, were built upon sacrifice unseen. Their story was never carved in triumphal arches, never sung by poets, never praised in Senate halls. Yet their suffering was as real as any victory, more enduring than any monument. Their story whispers still in the dark, reminding us that empires rise not upon glory, but upon the broken backs of the forgotten. And so when we speak of Rome, we must also speak of them. We must remember the farmer, torn from his fields, the mother who wept in darkness, the child who never knew the sun. We must remember the coughs that echoed in the tunnels, the lashes that tore into flesh, the chains that never broke. We must remember that while emperors sought immortality in marble, it was the slaves who gave their lives to make it possible. They were the shadow behind the light, the silence beneath the song, the foundation of an empire that would rather they be forgotten. But memory is a form of justice. To speak their story is to break the silence. To tell of their suffering is to deny Rome the victory of erasure. For though history abandoned them, though Rome consumed them, though centuries buried their names, we who remember give them voice once more. They were not only slaves, they were human. They lived, they suffered, they deserved the sun. So let the world hear of the forgotten slaves of the salt mines. Let their cries echo again. Let their story remind us that no empire is built without blood, and no wealth is gained without cost. And let us honor them not with silence, but with remembrance. For though Rome has fallen, their story endures in every grain of salt still drawn from the earth. A story of pain, a story of endurance, a story of humanity chained and yet unbroken.